The National Veterans Memorial and Museum began with a vision from the late Senator John Glenn, who understood the value of telling and sharing the story of our veterans. From the initial view, the architecture impresses upon visitors the importance of what lies within. Seeming to rise organically from the earth, the building itself is a symbol of our nation's veterans and their resilient spirit and unending commitment to making this country stronger. Once inside the museum, visitors embark on a narrative journey, following exhibitions that focus on the servicemen and women and their families. Individual stories and shared experiences are illustrated through personal artifacts, quotes, letters, photographs, and powerful films of veterans telling their unique story in their own words. The National Veterans Memorial and Museum. It's more than a museum. It's the new home of the brave. Plan your visit today.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining our latest Veteran Voices program at the National Veterans Memorial and Museum. My name is Colonel Retired Bill Butler, Chief of Staff. On behalf of our President and CEO, Lieutenant General Retired Mike Farrader, welcome as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of victory over Japan Day and the end of World War II, and we honor the men and women of the greatest generation who served and sacrificed in the name of freedom. Today marks the 75th anniversary of the Allied victory over Imperial Japan in World War II. On September 2nd, 1945, President Harry S. Truman announced Japan's unconditional surrender after formal documents were signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Harbor. September 2nd became known as VJ Day. More importantly, it marks the end of the most destructive war in the history of mankind. Some estimates put the death toll between 60 and 85 million men, women, and children, the vast majority civilians. The war was fought on every continent except South America and Antarctica, although Brazil sent 250,000 men to fight for the Allies. When America was thrust into the war in December 1941, it had already been raging for over 2 years. Not only did we have to fight a two-front war throughout Europe and North Africa and the vast expanse of the Pacific theaters of operation, but because of our unrivaled industrial capacity, we supplied all of the major Allied forces. Out of this unprecedented global destruction were born the alliances, systems, reconstruction plans, and shifts in power that ushered in Pax Americana, the American peace. This ensured relative peace in the Western Hemisphere and later the world for over 7 decades. This did not happen on accident, and Allied victory was never a sure thing. It happened because of the selflessness, determination, and sacrifices of men and women from the greatest generation. Men and women who put it all on the line to protect our country, our way of life, and deliver others from dictatorships and death camps. Today, we have a wonderful program to talk with some great Americans about World War II. Facilitating the discussion is Lieutenant General Mike Farrader. Joining him is Miss Tracie Hunter, an award-winning videographer and storyteller. Mr. David Greene, a Marine Corps veteran who fought on Iwo Jima, and Mr. Dan McBride, an Army paratrooper who jumped into Normandy on D-Day, into Holland for Operation Market Garden, was at the Bastogne, defense of Bastogne, and also fought to Hitler's Eagle's Nest in southern Germany. Sir, over to you. Sir, you're muted.
Well, thank you, Bill, and welcome everybody. It's a great day to be a veteran, and especially great to be one here at the National Veterans Memorial Museum in Columbus, Ohio, but also across the country, speaking to you today about Victory Japan Day. And I am truly honored to have our guest today, Dan McBride from the 101st, a great paratrooper who fought in the European campaign, and then David Greene, as Bill stated, an amazing Marine who fought in the sands of Iwo Jima. And then the storyteller who in of herself brings these magnificent stories of heroism to all of us so that we never forget the service and sacrifice. So Tracie, thank you for coming as well. And I just want to say a quick word to our staff here at the National Veterans Memorial Museum who allow us to do this. Now on the 13th of March, we came together as in our really about 18th month of being open, and knew that we would have to close our doors to the public as far as walking through the museum. But this innovative staff and team said, you know what, we don't need to quit, and we'll never quit. Instead, we'll just use virtual, digital, and online presentation to tell the stories of our veterans and these great Americans. And so we did. And so whereas we might have had you in the Great Hall surrounded by admirers numbering in the 100 or 200, more than 5,000 people, ranging even higher in the next 3 weeks, will get to hear your great stories of service and sacrifice and leadership, and then a couple war stories along the way. So this shift has allowed us to present now more than 8 programs during the COVID-19 shutdown, and to never stop honoring and connecting and inspiring and educating people about the veterans. So I'm going to start with a few questions here, and really I'm going to start with David Greene and just ask, why did you join the Marine Corps at that time of your life, and what did it mean to you?
Well, it's called the draft.
Okay.
They said, we'd like you to be with us for the next few years, plus 6 months. So along came a draft card, and I have 3 older brothers. 2 older brothers had already gone into the service immediately in the January of 1942. My next brother, 3 years older than myself, was involved with the industry. John Deere Company was building tank transmissions, and he was a tool and die operator. So he was deferred for several years. He went into the service finally a year after I went in. But I got a card, of course, from the President of the United States asking me and telling me that he would like to have me defend his country one way or another. Well, first of all, I did not want to be in the Army. I'm sorry for those that represent the Army. I wanted to be in the Marine Corps. Well, I'm not a very big guy. I'm only 5'6" to begin with. You have to be 5'4" or more to even be in there. Most guys were 5'10" to up to 6 foot. So when we fell out in front of our tents in boot camp, you know where I stood on the fallout. There'd be 30 guys. I just fell out on the left-hand end. And the others, it's interesting because fellow Marines a lot of these people were still growing. You're only 18 years old. We had guys that actually grew several inches while they were in the Marine Corps. And in a sense, it was just sort of one of those interesting crazinesses. We did our training in San Diego. Everybody west of the Mississippi went to San Diego. And so several of us took a bus to Des Moines, Iowa, jumped on a train. One of the older guys was in charge of us. It ended up we had 30 guys that were heading out to San Diego. And just as an aside, you pull into the depot there at San Diego, there's a great big brick building standing right alongside the railroad track. And at the very top, there was a great big painted sign on it, Wrath Blackhawk Ham. Well, that's Waterloo, Iowa. So it was just like, hey, no
Away from home.
matter where you go, there you are.
Well, Dan, thanks, David. And Dan, tell us how it was that you came to join the Army and to become a paratrooper?
Well, in 1941, I was a senior in high school, and I took a girl to a movie about in October. I don't remember what the movie was, but they had a movie-tone news showing experimenting with paratroops. My girl says, "Oh, they got to be so brave," and I said, "They got to be out of their mind," because I was always afraid of heights. Well, anyway, when on this December 7th, my dad and I were up on a roof pounding nails in an extension on our house, and my mother turned the radio up and they told where the Japs had bombed Pearl Harbor. My dad was a World War I veteran who was badly wounded, still in the hospital a year after the war ended. But anyway, he was a great Army man. And I figured right there, I'm going to go. So I went down. This was on a Sunday, it happened. On Monday, I went down to join the Army. And they told me to come back when I was 18. So I had to wait until my 18th birthday, April 9th, 1942. So I went down and I signed up. Right then, the draft had just started, and all these camps were getting full of draftees. So they said they have to hold you back a little bit before you go. And he said, and by the way, you better ask me what I wanted, and I told paratroops. And he said, you better take a week and think about it. I said, I've thought about it. I want to go. Anyway, they called me up in July, and I was sent to Camp Walter, Texas, for basic infantry training. But to go back a little, in 1940, I was 16 years old. I went to a citizens military training camp in Fort Benjamin, Harrison, Indiana. And I had just like a month of basic training. And I had been qualified with the 03 Springfield and the BAR and the light machine gun and a 60 millimeter mortar, all that stuff when I was only 16 years old. Anyway, I got in the Army, and they put me out in Camp Walter, Texas for basic training. Well, a funny thing happened there, because my dad had told me all about our training in World War I. And he told about when he was going to demonstrate hand grenades. See, and he said the guy had it up there, and he says, as long as you hold the handle down, it's all right. And you can pull a pin. And if you decide you don't want to throw it and you put it back, you can put the pin back, and all of a sudden he dropped it in front, And everybody took off running. My dad said that was the wrong thing to do. So when I was taking basic training out in Camp Walter, Texas, they said it's going to demonstrate hand grenades. So I'm only 18 years old, a wise guy, And so I managed to sit in the front row, and this captain did exactly the same words that my dad had told me he was going to do. And when he dropped that grenade in front, everybody took off running, but I picked it up picked a grenade up and threw it through the window of the barracks. And he says, good thinking, soldier. And I wasn't nothing quick thinking about it. I knew what I was going to do before. But anyway, that went through the sergeant's window and knocked his wife's picture off the desk in his room. And I was on his list the rest of the time. But anyway, I was in excellent shape because I'd been working all my life. And when they called us up, when I finished basic training, they shipped a bunch of us, about 200 guys, volunteered for paratroops because they found out to go make $50 a month more.
Mm-hmm.
So when we got to Camp Walter, or Fort Benning, Georgia, we got off the train and these sergeants come out there. They just wearing white T-shirts and jump pants, and they said that their job was to make us all quit. And he says, from now on, there's two things that do not exist. One of them is sympathy, and the other is a second chance. You fall out once, you're done. And every time we go any place, they had a truck following us, and anybody that fell out, they'd take them out and ship them to the MPs, which is the biggest insult they could do. But to make a long story short, out of the 230 some guys that volunteered, 43 of us made it through. And I had my choice. I could either go to the 82nd or 101st. Well, I didn't know nothing about either one of them, but the Eagle looked prettier than the AA did, so I went to 101st. And we went down to Camp Walter, Texas, and we took basic training there. Took training there, and every day we'd get up, and when we first started out, we'd run a mile out and a mile back at 4 o'clock in the morning. The second day, we'd go 2 miles out and 2 miles back. And the third day, 3 miles out and 3 miles back. And every time we're losing more men because they fall out, and put them on a truck, and they disappear. Anyway, make a long story short, we went on Tennessee maneuvers in the early part of 43. And then we went back to Fort Bragg. They got to give us all a 7-day furlough to go home. And we had to take all our insignia off and put leggings on over our jump boots so they'd think we was regular infantry. They shipped us to Camp Shanks, New York, and put us on a boat on September 3rd, 1943. And we left New York Harbor September 4th, and we got to England October 19th, which is 44 days, which is 4 days longer than it took Columbus. What happened? The boat, there was about 5,000 paratroops and 200 WACs on this boat, the Strathnaver, British boat. And when we got on the boat, they handed you a round roll of canvas. I said, what do I do with this? This limey sergeant says, you hang it on a hook, so bloomin' amok, So I hung it on a hook, But anyway, somebody had put salt water in the freshwater tanks, and the desalinator ain't working. So they kicked us out of the convoy and sent us into St. John's, Newfoundland. They took the women off, 200 women out there. They took them up and put them in the Camp Shanks or Camp Pepperell and in St. John's, Newfoundland. And we got off and double timed around those hills for 2 weeks while he was working on it. Then we got it back, they got it fixed, we got on the boat, we started out and they hit a rock in the harbor. They went back in, the women back to the camp. We got off, started double timing over the hills again. So we did that for about 3 or 4 more days, and they figured, well, we can make it anyway. So we all loaded on the boat again, and we started out. We got a day out, and we found out it was taking water faster, the pumps get rid of it. So we went back into St. John's, Newfoundland, and we went back to the camp. We got off, double timed around the hills. They deterred an American ship, the John Erickson, coming from North Africa, picked us up in St. John's, Newfoundland, took us back to Nova Scotia, Halifax, Nova Scotia, resupplied, and we joined another convoy, and finally got to England 44 days after we left New York Harbor.
I see. Well, let's hold it there for just a second and switch back back over to David for just a second. So describe what you remember most about your training and your first deployment to move out after training.
What was that again? No, it's on to David.
Pardon?
They're talking to the other one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you-
That's all right. Go ahead, David.
Okay. Okay. Of course, I got a postcard from the President of the United States asking me if I'd like to serve my country, or more or less telling me. And I had, so anyway, being west of the Mississippi, when I was asked about going into the service, I said I wanted to go into the Marine Corps. I did not want to go in the Army and walk across Europe. I would just as soon go out in the Pacific Ocean and ride around on ships and be taken from island to island and so forth, which we were doing through the war. So anyway, I ended up going to San Diego with about 30 of us. They said, take along a small little satchel with you. So when you get out there in boot camp, you can put your civilian clothes in the bag and send it home. And from that point on, you'll be wearing Marine Corps attire. Interestingly enough, we pulled into the depot there at San Diego and looked up to the right. And here's a big building, brick building right alongside the railroad track. And right up along the top of the building, it said, Wrath Blackhawk Ham. Well, that's Waterloo, Iowa. So I felt right at home. Wrath, no matter where you went. And we found that out in the service, that we were having Wrath Ham all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, went into boot camp and it was interesting because everything there in San Diego, every light that was towards the ocean was blackened out. All the street lights were painted black on the ocean side, and every vehicle that was driving, for its headlights, it just had little tiny slits to let just enough light out so that somebody could see that you were coming. It was totally, if you were standing out on the beach looking back at San Diego, you couldn't see anything. There was no light at all. At night, they'd put balloons up with cables hanging down so that if anybody was thinking about making an air attack and strafing the San Diego area, they get tangled up in these balloons and the stuff that's hanging down from them. But it wasn't too long that we had a ship that carried us out to do some practice landings, things like that. But that didn't last long because they needed us as backup for the Saipan invasion out in the Pacific. So we headed out with a convoy, just the 26th Marine Regiment, which is like 1/3 of the division, plus a bunch of tanks and some artillery pieces and things like that, to make up literally 1/3 of a division heading out to do backup work for the Marianas campaign. We didn't quite get there, and they decided they didn't need us. The campaign was going okay. So the ships turned around and went back to Hawaii. So we pulled into Hilo and unloaded the ships, got on, they have this narrow gauge railway. Hawaii at that time was producing sugar cane. as you approached the island, what you saw was a great big green mountain. And what it was about 7, 8 foot tall sugar cane facing you. So we got into this little narrow gauge railway, went through 11 tunnels on the way to get to the north end of the island. And we spent our training there on the big Parker Ranch. This is a 25,000 acre ranch there on Hawaii, full of cattle and stuff like that, of course, also. But that's where we did our basic training. From that point on, we took out, got on board ships, and headed for Iwo Jima. We were on board ship for 50 days to get to that stinking little island. We stopped at one place, Kwajalein, I believe it was, to refuel and do some last mailing of letters and things like that. But we invaded Iwo Jima on February the 19th, 1945. I went in on what was called Red Beach 1. Green Beach was the closest to Mount Suribachi. That was the 28th Marine Corps Regiment, 28th Regiment. They made a left turn and took over Mount Suribachi. I was cutting, our group cut straight across the island, which at that point, right at the mountain, is only 700 yards wide. We cut straight across to go up the west coast and do our share on the west coast of the island. That's the 5th Marine Division. 3rd Marine Division was going up the opposite island. And later on, as the island shaped like a pork chop, it finally becomes about 2 miles wide. We had to bring another Marine Division in so that we had enough men to cover that 2-mile long front line. So that battle lasted 36 days. In 36 days, you never took your shoes off, your socks, you didn't change any uniform or anything else. And when we left the island, I was Marine radio man shipped ashore while we loaded ships out. And they the people on board ship came ashore with a small boat, picked me up and took me out to the ship, and I can't think of the name right now, but it was a big old banana boat. It wasn't a Liberty ship. It was a bigger ship that would then commandeered and forced into the use during World War. So anyway, I went aboard that ship, and I'm sure they wondered, where in the hell has this guy been? I was the dirtiest looking little bugger you ever saw in your life, never having ever changed your clothes or anything else. Basically, I think all of us, when we got on board that ship, they just threw our uniforms away and issued new uniforms and so forth, because we were just such a dirty, stinking mess. Because I was one of the first ones on, they weighed me in. I only weighed 136 pounds to begin with. And when they ran me through the little physical there, I weighed 122 pounds. I'd lost all that weight just trying to stay alive, and you don't stick your nose into a can of food when you know there's an enemy out there
Hmm.
trying to find you in a bad moment and ready to pick you off. So regardless of what your position was, I carried a carbine rifle. They started out issuing us sidearms, had a 45 caliber pistol. They found out that the range on that of any ability to hit and kill anybody was about 8 feet. Beyond that, you're going to be wildly shooting, hitting nothing. Carbine was a little bit better than that. But as the battle wore on, I never fired a shot.
Hmm.
When my battle was over, 36 days later, I was the first guy to go aboard ship. I buried all my ammunition on the sands. We weren't allowed to take any ammunition aboard any ship. They would issue it as you left it.
That's interesting.
None comes back aboard.
Well, David, let me ask Dan a question, and then we'll come back to you. But for each of you, your stories are amazing to us. And I served 35 years, and Bill served 30 years. And just the thought of sustained combat over that long period of time is really inspiring to us. So, Dan, you were in the Battle of the Bulge, and you parachuted into Holland, and you parachuted into Normandy. Which of those is most memorable to you, and which one was the scariest?
Well, when we was living in England, we were at a place called Denford House. We were living in Quonset huts. And we was running all over England. We were jumping about 2 or 3 times a week sometimes, experimenting different ways to assembly and different ways to hold your equipment and everything. And they had to see my job was sniper. I was a combination sniper and rifle grenadier. And I had an 03A3 Springfield, which is you couldn't take apart like an M1 to jump with. So I had to have it in a bundle underneath the plane. And when I was jumping in third position, when you go out the door, you hit the switch and it releases the bundle underneath the plane. It's got your gun and a machine gun in it.
That's good.
Anyway, we tried that in England 3 times and worked perfect. Well, when they're getting ready to go to Normandy, they took and put us in a marshalling area on the airport. We studied sand tables and photographs and had everything planned out exactly where he's supposed to go. See? And everything worked good in training. And we're getting ready the day before, June 5th, actually on June 4th, they took us in and gave us the biggest meal you ever had. You can have whatever you want, steak or chicken and ice cream and the whole works, You get ready to go that night, and they called it off. Too windy, too rain. So we went back to the barracks, where we were living in huts, tents. The next day, we had dinner. We had bologna sandwiches because they'd run all the food out the day before. And we was down at the airport, getting there. We blackened our faces, and we were putting adjusting our chutes, getting ready to get on the planes. And we'd done the same thing the day before, And I asked the lieutenant, I said, "What's this, another dry run?" And he looked up, and here's Eisenhower, And he said, "What do you think?" Well, our battalion, the 2nd Battalion of the 502nd Parachute Infantry, is going to be the point of the spearhead. He's going to be the first ones in. So Eisenhower is talking to each one of us. He stopped in front of me, and he says, "Where are you from, soldier?" I says, "Ohio." He says, "Are you afraid?" And I says, "No." He says, "Well, I am." And he stepped to the guy next to me. It was Joe Pistone. And he said, "Where are you from, soldier?" And Joe says, "Yonkers." Eisenhower says, "You mean that suburb of New York City?" And Joe says, "What do you mean, suburb?" Talking to a 5-star general. And Eisenhower just laughed, And then he called everybody together. He was asking if anybody's from Ohio or anybody from Kansas or anybody from Texas, and he got to Lieutenant Strobel from Michigan. And he said, asked him where he's from, and he said, Michigan. And Eisenhower said, I was up there fishing for muskies. He says, man, I like the way they fight. That's when they took that famous picture. They had the captains on the picture. It says that he's saying victory or nothing, Actually, he was talking about fishing.
No doubt.
I was standing about 15 feet from him. I heard every word he said. Anyway, we got on the planes and we took off, and they had to circle around. It was still daylight when we took off, 10:45 in the evening, just getting dark. And we circled around and we flew out 600 feet over the invasion fleet, right over them. I was standing at the door looking straight down 600 feet. And I didn't believe there was that many ships in the world. It looked like the whole channel was moving. And I figured, well, we got a lot of company. So he made a turn between the Jersey and the Jersey Island and headed in from the backside of the peninsula. When we got on the planes, there was two orders we had. One would be hooked up before you crossed the coast, all ready to go. And two, you'll take no prisoners for the first 24 hours or until we make contact with the beach troops. We got a mission to complete. We can't be handling prisoners. So anyway, everything's going fine. We're flying in real tight formation. We crossed the coast and run into a fog bank. And that's when Murphy's Law took over. Everybody, the pilots were all young guys like we were, and they all separated. When we come out of the fog bank, all I can see is streams of red tracers coming up and anti-aircraft fire bursting all around. I'm standing looking down, thinking, man, I got to step out into this stuff, So anyway, the pilot, instead of staying in formation, he's trying to dodge these streams of tracers. And we're trying to keep our balance hanging on the static line of the plane. Anyway, he was going too low and too fast, and he turned the green light on. The lieutenant disappeared, the sergeant disappeared, and I was just reaching for the door, going out the door. Just as I reached for that switch, he rolled the plane sideways. That threw me off balance, and I went out the door head first. My shins hit the bottom of the door, and that somersaulted me. See? When that chute opened, I got one awful opening shock. And the first thing you do, you look up to check the chute. Well, I looked up, and there was a ground, and I looked down, and there's the chute. Now, I'd never been to France before, but it didn't right to me. My left foot was hung up in suspension lines, and I'm hanging upside down. The second I saw what it was, I bent over. I was going to try to crawl up my leg, just as I bent over, I slammed into the ground, and the lights went out. And I don't know, no idea how long I laid there. But all of a sudden, I became aware of the fact that I'm laying in knee-deep wet grass and everything hurt. So I got to thinking, I start moving, make sure everything still worked. And then it come to me, this ain't no maneuver, this is a real McCoy, this is Indian country. So I didn't know where I was because I knew where I wasn't. I wasn't where I was supposed to be. And it's overcast, it just got through rain and everything is wet. And I got out of the harness and I had to carry a folding stock carbine because my rifle was in the bundle, which I never found, by the way. And I didn't know which way to go, but I thought they were supposed to assemble the north side of the area. So I start moving slowly because my hip hurt from that shock. And I kept this up for about 45 minutes. I'm walking through the grass, taking it real slow, listening. And all of a sudden I heard somebody walking through the grass, walking fast. Now in my imagination, it was an 8-foot tall German with a machine gun. See? But I squatted down and tried to silhouette him, but the hedgerows were too high. And I could see, I couldn't make him out, but I could just catch a sign of movement. And so I got pulled up with that carbine. I was going to shoot, but I thought, man, maybe it's one of our guys. So I pulled out the clicker. We had a clicker to signal each other. And I clicked it, and that German said, moo, and a whole stampede of cows took off through the brush, you know. By the time my heartbeat got back to about 400 a minute, I moved off again. And I kept this up, and it seemed like forever, you know. And I hadn't seen nobody. I had heard nobody. I could hear a lot of firing in the distance, but I couldn't figure out which way it's coming from because the hedgerows screwed the sound up so much you couldn't tell where it's coming from. But I kept moving on until it was starting to get daylight. That's about 4 o'clock in the morning. So it's been about 4 hours since I jumped, you know. And there was a hedgerow there with a branch hanging down. So instead of walking around it, I picked the branch, lifted the branch up. And when I did, there was a Berkshire machine gun fire went through that bush. I dropped down and I thought it was one of our guys. I said, yeah, so I pulled the clicker out and I clicked it and I got another burst. And I said, well, he one of our guys. Then I got mad. I said, I'll bet you trying to kill me. And I knew about where he was. On the other side of the hedgerow, I just came up. Now these hedgerows are about anywhere from 4 to 8 feet high, all solid rock and dirt with trees and stuff growing on them, and ditches on the side. So I eased the lack along the ditch till I got opposite where I thought he was. And I took it through a piece of dirt up ahead, and it did. There was a burst of fire again. So I knew right exactly where he was. And I didn't have no confidence in that carbine at all. So I took a grenade and I pulled the pin and I let the handle fly off and counted 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, and I tossed it up over the hedge. And it went off. I run up the side of the hedge and let go all 15 of them on that carbine. But evidently, that grenade had been right alongside him when it went off because he's an awful looking mess, but his gun's laying there. I never saw one like it. Picked it up and had a long curved clip. And it was a lot better gun than that carbine, which we hated, by the way. I took the thing by the barrel, took the carbine by the barrel, and I wrapped it around a tree, and I threw it in a ditch, and I took his gun. Foolishly, I didn't look for any more ammunition on him. I picked up his gun.
Well, let's hold that thought for, Dan, let's hold that thought for just a second. We're going to transition just a little bit here. And David, I understand that you were able to go back to Iwo Jima. You were able to sponsor Japanese students after the war. So let's turn towards sort of the humanity side of this, and then we'll invite Tracie to give some insights as she's gotten to know you. So David, tell us about those who've come and students and visited and been mentored by you, as well as your return trips to Iwo Jima, please.
Well, I made a return trip to Iwo Jima about 8 years ago through the Greatest Generations Foundation, Denver, Colorado. But in the meantime, after the war, getting myself married, having a family and all this and that, we got involved with a group that brought 12 foreign students. They actually were college students, 12 at a time, plus a leader that was several years older. But they would come to Iowa. They started out, they would land in the West Coast, travel across through the country, ended up down in Iowa, dispersed out into one girl or boy into each home. And they were with us for a month's time. So we got quite well acquainted with Isako Nishiwaki. That was her name at that particular time. And so while she was here in Waterloo, she was interested in not only finding out, about Iowa and USA, but she was interested in about the community itself. So while she was here, she decided in her spare time, while I was at work, of course, yet I had not retired, um, she would, we had a junior college. So she decided she was going to take up the Spanish language and a few other things. And she then went back to Japan, but came back just a short time later upon our invitation if she wanted to come back, and stayed with us for 6 months. Well, that caused us to become much more closely related to the Japanese.
Hmm.
And in a sense, it sort of brought things into the vision that, you know, even though the Japanese were your worst enemy way back when, we were friends today. So we made actually 2 different trips to Japan. When we would go, we would stay there about a month's time,
Mm.
visiting staying in the Japanese homes, which was not common at all. Basically, when they came to the United States, of course, they stayed in our homes. The Japanese habit is you don't stay in their homes. You stay in a ryokan, which is a local neighborhood hotel. You're very well kept and you're close to your family, but you don't stay in their home, period. Well, they changed all that. But not only that, but her father, upon knowing we were coming back, going to come back to Japan again sometime, we had a date set in the future. He said, we've got to build a better house. So they went out on the edge of town of their city and built a new home so that the next time that we came, why, we'd have a nicer place to stay. Now, in her father was in the painting business. And if you're a businessman, you do not drive your own car. You have a driver. You are not humbling yourself to drive. You always have somebody drive for you. So because they lived way out now on the edge of town, he'd have one of his men come out with the car and come out to the new house, pick him up, take him back downtown, and get into the business mode. But there were a lot of habits, and of course they drive on the wrong side of the street. Things
Hmm.
like you have to get used to.
Well, David, let me ask Tracie a few questions, and Dan as well. It's quite an honor for us to be with you two gentlemen and all the Marines and paratroopers that you represent and that you've been buddies with for your whole life. So, Tracie, how did you get involved in this? And who are these 2 characters that we're talking to today? Because you know them as well as anybody, no doubt.
Absolutely. So I am a filmmaker and I do documentaries. And my grandfather was in World War II. He was in the Battle of the Bulge, and I never met him. And it was something that I know he never really talked about a lot to the family. And I wanted to get to know him more. So I started working with World War II veterans about 5 years ago, and then started searching for gentlemen that were in the prison camp with my own grandfather. Went to go interview them, and it just snowballed. And I said, you know what, this is something that I really love. This generation is incredible, and I love spending time with these guys. So I started the organization Beyond the Call, and our goal is to preserve these stories. And so we go and we interview them, spend the day together, and then turn their stories into short documentaries. So Dan and David are both 2 of my guys that I've had the pleasure to meet and interview. And David's story is complete, and we're still in production on Dan's story, but it's just been the absolute biggest joy of my life. And these gentlemen that you're with today are two of my personal heroes. And just, I'm very honored to be in their presence.
Well, that's great. And tell us about the organization Beyond the Call.
So Beyond the Call it was started about 2 years ago, and we have interviewed over 20 World War II veterans to date and put out 4 documentaries currently, and we're about to release another one this year. But each story is focused on the history of the veterans, but we also like to remember the 75 years of their life after the war and include their families in these stories. And many of our veterans have a lot of focus on reconciliation and moving forward, and how what they went through is still relevant today, and how younger generations can learn from them. So I know, obviously, David and his family have brought in Japanese throughout the years. Dan himself has been very intentional in befriending a former German soldier. Many of our guys, my favorite quote from one of our veterans is, "War is the ultimate failure of mankind." An Iwo Jima veteran, Charlie Kohler, said this, but it's something that I think many of our veterans are focused on. How do we move forward from here? How do we take these lessons and continue to learn from them and use our past to guide our future?
And then if there's one thing that you wanted people to know that on how they could support Beyond the Call, how would that be?
So Beyond the Call is a registered 501c3 nonprofit, and people can go on our Facebook, or we have a GoFundMe page, and donate. 100% of the donations go back into production cost and traveling to reach these veterans. As you know, we have such little time left with this generation, so there's an urgency on our hearts to reach as many of these veterans as possible. So any donations that are given support going back to these veterans.
And that was beyondthecall.org?
Yes, it's www.beyondthecall.com. Yes, and we have a Facebook page that we're quite active on that people can go to and support it.
We too are a 501c3 and don't receive any federal funding, and our programming such as this today, we would ask you others out there to become members of the National Veterans Memorial Museum and to support us and to support Tracie so that we can honor the greatest generation. And gentlemen, we're going to wrap it up here in a second, but on behalf of everyone, congratulations on victory in Japan. Thank you for our freedom. Thank you for the victory in Europe, Dan, and our freedom. Amazingly, we are connected in so many ways by the units that Bill and I have served with, the parachuting that we've done. David, I got to go to Guadalcanal with my father, who was a U.S. Army infantryman who went up the island chain and all the way through the island of Luzon. And so I've walked on some of the grounds that you have, and I learned to ski in Birch's Garden at the Eagle's Nest, Dan. So it was a little easier on me back in the 60s than it was for you, no doubt. But we really want to thank you, the greatest generation. And Tracie, thank you for what you're doing to help tell their story. And here at the National Veterans Memorial Museum, we partner with great people who want to honor our veterans and impact the lives of those from the greatest generation all the way to our current post 9/11 magnificently bearded and tattooed veterans who served in the current conflict. And with that, God bless you all, and God bless our veterans. And I'd like to turn over back to our Chief of Staff, Colonel Bill Butler, to wrap this up for us.
Sir, thank you. Gentlemen, thank you for our freedom. Thanks for your service, and thanks for the example that you set for countless paratroopers and Marines and infantrymen for the last 70 years. So Tracie, we appreciate your partnership on this and the wonderful storytelling that you do. It's great to be able to help amplify the stories that you've captured for America. And so just as a reminder, we're both 501c3 nonprofits, and memberships and donations and sponsorships run the machine. They fund us and help us provide this sort of programming. So we would encourage everybody to, if able, consider donating or becoming a member of the National Veterans Memorial or Museum or www.beyondthecall.org. And just a couple of announcements for the museum. We've got our Bob Hope So Ready for Laughter exhibit from the National World War II Museum. That's been extended through the end of the year because of the pandemic. So if you haven't had a chance to come here to see it, don't worry, it's going to be here until January 3rd. This Saturday, September 5th, join us at 10 o'clock for another virtual rally point. We'll be hosting Lieutenant General retired Nadia West. She's the 44th Surgeon General of the Army. She's a graduate of the 2nd West Point class that allowed women, and she's the first African-American woman 1-star, 2-star, and 3-star general. So she's got an amazing story to share with everybody this Saturday. Next Friday, September 11th, join us at 12 o'clock. We're partnering with the City of Columbus and Franklin County as we commemorate Patriot Day here virtually, but we'll have our speakers here in the museum. And then Friday, September 18th, we welcome We the People, Portraits of Veterans in America. That's a critically acclaimed artist, Mary White, and her portraits of 50 veterans. And they're just beautiful, beautiful paintings. And then finally, on Monday, September 21st, is our next Red Cross blood drive. And as many people know, and some probably don't, our nation is critically short of blood supplies due to the pandemic and canceled blood drives nationwide. 1 pint of blood saves 3 lives. So if able, would encourage everybody to come to the museum and donate some blood on September 21st. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Again, thank you to our guests for making this possible, and everybody have a great day.